Hello and welcome to Hidden History, Understanding the Origins of Racial Inequity. This is panel 2 of our series of 3 panels. I'm Brian Conybeare from ABC 57 News in South Bend. I'll be your host for this discussion of the role that historical events played in the creation and perpetuation of racial imbalance in American society. The history we learned in school is only part of our country's real story, and sometimes the parts that are overlooked can help illustrate how things came to be the way they are right now. Recent events across the country, from the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis to the assault on the U.S. Capitol building in January, have heightened the interest in the differences in how Black and white Americans view and experience the country that we all share as one. This is the second of 3 panel discussions that span the scope of American history. The 3 members of panel 2 tonight will focus on the middle period of our Civil War related history, the Emancipation Proclamation, through the period after Reconstruction. After their presentations, there's going to be plenty of time for you to ask questions to one or all of our guests, and you can submit your questions through the Zoom Q&A function. These panel discussions are sponsored by Spectrum Health Lakeland Medical Center and its Community Grand Rounds initiative, as well as by Lake Michigan College in Benton Harbor, with the cooperation of the City of St. Joseph and the City Commission there. Our goal in these discussions really is not to cover every aspect of American history. That would be very difficult. It would take longer than 90 minutes. But we want to highlight specific events that aren't generally very well known, but can help us understand how race-based inequity came to exist here in this country. Let me introduce our panel for this evening. First, we have Dr. Kate Mazur. She's an associate professor at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, and an author of a new book on the nation's early civil rights efforts. Dr. Bill Harris is an emeritus professor of history at the University of New Hampshire and is the author of several books about segregation in the Deep South. And Christopher Everett is an award-winning documentary filmmaker whose full-length film tells the story of the Wilmington uprising in Delaware. We'll get to that in a moment. We'll begin with Professor Kate Mazur. Black Americans took advantage of the many hard-won opportunities in the wake of the Civil War and made some critical social, political, and economic advances. The nation, and the Deep South in particular, were forced for the first time, though, to contemplate the lasting consequences of slavery and the slave-based economy, and then what comes next. Let's start with Professor Mazur. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. And so if you could start my slideshow, please, I would appreciate it. Great. So I'm here today as chronologically the first person on our panel, and I'm going to be giving a kind of brief historical overview of the period of emancipation through Reconstruction. And so can I have the next slide, please? So my instructions were to start with the Emancipation Proclamation, but I decided I needed to start a little bit earlier than that. We can't just kind of pick up right in 1863. So the 3 central points I would like to emphasize today are as follows. First, the American Civil War was a conflict over slavery and led to slavery's abolition. African Americans themselves were crucial to that story. Second, the abolition of slavery required a rethinking of American life and government. One outcome was 3 constitutional amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. These represented ideas about race, equality, and power that were new to the US Constitution. And third, for Black Americans, freedom opened many new possibilities. But white reaction was fierce, and the US government tragically did not deliver on its promises to protect their rights. And so that's the ground I'm hoping to cover in my brief time today, and then my fellow panelists are going to kind of pick up where I left off. So let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to begin by talking about the causes of the Civil War and African Americans' role in producing the freedom and the abolition of slavery that emerged from it. Next slide. In 1860, when Abraham Lincoln was elected president, there were about 4 million enslaved people living in the United States in the southern, and they were located in the southern states. And the map on the left is actually an 1860 map mapping census data onto counties in the United States. And you can see this is a map showing the concentrations of African-American population. And you can see the darker areas are where the largest Black populations lived, and very much so along the Mississippi River, but also scattered throughout what's called the Black Belt that crosses through South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama. There were also in the United States about 500,000 free African Americans, about evenly distributed between the slave states and the free states. Now, slavery, as you probably know, slavery itself and cotton were a powerful economic engine. Cotton was at the heart of the slavery-based economy, and here's a picture of two enslaved men in the foreground using a cotton gin to process cotton, while women work in carrying the cotton, and two white men, a little bit in the background, are looking at the cotton and seeing how the quality is. And that's kind of a scene of labor in cotton and plantation agriculture from this era. Slaves were construed as property. And in 1860, they were valued at about $3 billion in 1860 dollars. That figure, $3 billion, was larger than the total value of capital invested in manufacturing, railroads, and banks combined at that time. So enslaved people considered property were immensely valuable to the Southern economy and really to the United States as a whole. Cotton accounted for close to 60% of American exports, and the United States was the largest cotton exporter in the world. Next slide. So many people learned in school that slavery wasn't really the conflict that caused the Civil War. They might have learned that it was about states' rights or it was about the tariff. Historians' consensus is that slavery was absolutely the cause of the Civil War. The Civil War was caused by a conflict over slavery. Slave owners were accustomed from the beginning of the United States to enjoying tremendous power and influence in the United States government, but their power was diminishing over time as the Northern population increased much more quickly than the Southern population did. And therefore the free states gained more and more power, particularly in the House of Representatives, and power to elect a president. And some of those sectional divisions were held in check by a two-party system in which both parties, the Whigs and the Democrats, drew on support from both sections of the country. But party politics kind of spiraled out of control, particularly in the 1860s, giving rise to the formation of a new political party, the Republican Party, which was almost entirely a Northern party, only existed in the free states. And the consensus around which it was built was opposition to any further extension of slavery in the United States. Growing numbers of people, residents in the free states, wanted to see slavery constrained and ultimately ended. Northerners, white Northerners, many of whom were actually quite racist, grew to resent what appeared to be an oligarchic power that stood for slavery and white supremacy and large land owning. And these Northerners argued slave owners didn't really like to work. They made other people do it for them. They increasingly developed a kind of notion that slave owning and the whole system of slavery was un-American, and that was not the best course for the United States going forward. So the Republican Party, formed in 1854, was the first national large-scale political party to take a stand against slavery. And when Lincoln ran for president in 1860, one plank of the platform, as I mentioned, was stopping the spread of slavery into new territories. Now, when Lincoln was elected in 1860, across the South, but first in South Carolina, political leaders quickly took action to take their state out of the Union. They wanted to form their own government, their own nation, whose government, as Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, said in March 1861, he said that the government of the Confederacy, the cornerstone, this is a quote, cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery and subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. So there is no doubt about what the Confederacy stood for. The Confederacy stood for the preservation and extension of slavery and white supremacy. And the war itself, the conflict, came about over a debate about the extension of slavery and the future of slavery in the United States. Next slide. Okay, so we have established that the war was about slavery. Now I want to talk about how the Civil War was in significant ways also about freedom. To make a long story short, and this is something that interests me a great deal and that I teach about regularly in my classes at Northwestern, slavery was abolished through the force, violence, and unpredictability of war, not because white Americans suddenly came to the conclusion that they ought to get rid of it. It's true that the United States government, under the leadership of Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans, didn't actually set out to immediately abolish slavery when the Civil War began, but that is what happened in the course of the war from 1861 to 1865. And here I want to make a really critical point. African Americans enslaved in the South took their own freedom as much as government ever gave it to them. Everywhere that US forces advanced into the slave states during the war, African Americans rushed out of slavery and into Army and Navy lines, seeking safety, demanding freedom, and often offering to serve the cause, whether as soldiers or even as laborers for the US military. Through their actions, they showed military and civilian officials that they were a force to be reckoned with, that they would not remain passive objects or pawns in a strategic game played out among high-level government officials or between two armies composed exclusively of white men. And the picture on the right-hand side that you see here is a famous scene at Fort Monroe, Virginia in June 1861. And this is an example, but an early example of how this is the coast of Virginia. The United States had occupied that in Confederate Virginia. US forces had sailed down the Atlantic coast and occupied this area near Norfolk, Fort Monroe. And the minute they got there and kind of took over the fort, enslaved people began to come into the fort or ask for admission to the fort and say, we are trying to get away from slavery. We're trying to get away from our owners. We want to be free. Please protect us. Please help us become free. And it started out with just a trickle. A few men famously got there on May 24th, 1861. And Army officials reported that by early June, there were more than 500 men, women, and children seeking shelter, seeking freedom in Fort Monroe. And this story played out again and again and again throughout the Confederacy. Wherever the United States Army went, enslaved people moved toward the Army and sought freedom and sought protection for them from their owners who would come looking for them. Next slide. The popular culture and illustrations of the Civil War show this dynamic, and this is just one of many illustrations. I like this one for all of the kind of motion in it of a Black family coming upon a United States officer. They're waving their flag. These African Americans who are coming along are waving a flag on the left side. There's a flag on the middle that is carried by the soldiers. And this is the kind of scene that repeats itself over and over again that we find very often in illustrated magazines and cartoons from the period. Next slide. So now we get to the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. But the steps that Black people had taken to get free meant that slavery was already eroding long before that, and it continued to do so after the Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation was a turning point in part because it formalized the policy that US forces were agents of liberation. And it set into motion the process of creating what was called the Bureau of Colored Troops and enlisting Black men in the service of the United States Army. By the end of the war, about 180,000 Black men had served in uniform for the United States, 80% of whom were from the South and more often than not born in slavery and enslaved until they enlisted in the United States Army. At the end of the war, 1/10 of the men who were in service to the United States Army were African American. And I really like this picture on the right, which shows a Black family that had obviously gone out of their way to get themselves photographed with the man in uniform. This is a real turning point for African Americans in so many different ways. Okay, next slide, please. So things were possible as a result of the friction and the violence of war, the unexpected decisions that people had to make, that people had not thought when the war began would ever be possible. People wrote at the time about feeling like they were living through decades in a single year. You know, the conditions of possibility, the things that were possible were changing incredibly dramatically. And as the war ended, the abolition of slavery required a real rethinking of certain basic fundamental aspects of American life until that point. Next slide, please. So the Emancipation Proclamation was essentially an executive order. It was a wartime measure. It did not permanently abolish slavery in the United States. It could be overturned. It could be rescinded. So it was actually the 13th Amendment, which Congress passed on January 31st, 1865, and was announced ratified on December 6, 1865, that permanently outlawed slavery in the United States. And the man on the right here is Henry Highland Garnett, a Black Presbyterian minister who made his early career before the Civil War in New York. And just after the 13th Amendment was passed by Congress, became the first African-American to speak in the House of Representatives. And he gave a lecture. It was being used as a kind of ceremonial place to hold a meeting of abolitionists. And his speech was about the 13th Amendment and its significance as a turning point in American history. This was really the first time that the United States tried to create a biracial democracy. Next slide. So it was not at the founding of the United States in which slavery had been permitted to continue and in which paltry protections had been offered for individual rights. It was not at the founding that the United States and its leaders attempted to create a biracial democracy or a multiracial democracy. It was here in Reconstruction that happened, and it happened because people had to think through what would be the consequences of the abolition of slavery and how to change American government to make sure that slavery would be permanently abolished and to kind of secure basic individual rights for all people. For the first time, Americans decided that they would use federal power in particular new ways. Federal power to abolish slavery in the states, that's the 13th Amendment, to require states to uphold people's civil rights, to ratify the idea of birthright citizenship, that citizenship was not for white people only, it was for anyone who was born in this country. And finally, to prohibit at the federal level racial discrimination in the right to vote. And all three amendments, if you look at them, have an enforcement clause that state that Congress has the power to enforce these amendments. That was totally new and different. Nothing like that had ever been in the Constitution before that explicitly gave Congress the power to enforce individual rights, even and especially when states violated those rights. Many argued at the time that this was way too much federal intervention in the states. For example, Andrew Johnson, the president of the United States, argued when he vetoed the first federal civil rights law that the provisions of the law would, quote, sap and destroy our federative system, and they were, quote, another step or rather stride towards centralization. So there were people who said the states should be allowed to decide what people's rights should be. We shouldn't have this level of federal intervention. But the Republicans, the party in power, drove their agenda forward despite the controversy because they were determined to set the nation on a new footing after the war, to end the abuses associated with slavery and to end white domination in politics. Next slide. As a result of these measures during Reconstruction, African-American men gained the right to vote for the first time. Some 2,000 African-American men served in office in this period, most of them in the southern states. The first Black members of the House and Senate are the most famous, and they're the ones pictured on the right-hand side. But African-Americans served at every level, including state legislatures, county officials, sheriffs, tax collectors. And in many ways, those very local officials were the most important, most pivotal officials in people's lives. Next slide. For Black Americans, freedom opened many new possibilities. In their daily lives, African Americans reunited with their loved ones, many of whom had been sold away during slavery. They raised money and started churches and independent schools. They built communities. They aspired to make a living, to farm. Many people in the post-slavery South it was an agricultural economy. What they wanted to do was own their own land and produce their own products for themselves and to sell at market. Next slide. Freedom opened many new possibilities, but tragically and horrifically, this experiment in biracial, multiracial democracy, kind of enforced supposedly by the federal government, was quickly undermined by white resistance in the South and by the refusal of the US government to back up what it had promised to do. Next slide. The Ku Klux Klan originally was founded in 1866 and became an organization, a decentralized organization whose members were determined to terrorize and threaten and sometimes attack and even kill and rape African Americans who seemed to be doing well economically, asserting their freedom, and particularly asserting their political power. Next slide. The summer of 1866 was particularly well known for its violence in Memphis and New Orleans, where white people attacked Black communities, burned deliberately in Memphis, burning African-American schoolhouses and churches, in New Orleans, interrupting a convention that had been trying to create a new state constitutional convention that would permit Black men to vote. This was before Black men had the right to vote in the kind of trajectory of Reconstruction, and these events were actually what helped prompt the Republicans in Congress to turn to a policy of Black men's enfranchisement to try to empower African Americans to bring into power at the local and state level people who would enforce their rights. Next slide. After Ulysses S. Grant, after Grant's election in 1868, the president himself tried to assist in cracking down on the Klan. Grant used the Justice Department to try to break up the Klan, but only with limited success because of the lack of personnel and really the intransigence of white resistance. One of the worst episodes of Reconstruction among many incredibly violent episodes in which white people attacked Black people to threaten, to intimidate, and ultimately to prevent them from exercising their right to vote was the Colfax Massacre of 1873, in which white militia armed with cannon and other weaponry shot down African Americans as they surrendered from a courthouse in Colfax, Louisiana. The death toll was upwards of 60 and possibly more than 100 African Americans who died in this attack, and only three white people ended up dead. And basically in these kinds of attacks, locally and at the state level, no one was ever brought to justice. The only way that anyone could have gotten justice at that time was to go into federal court. And the Supreme Court itself played a role in making sure that the constitutional amendments and the civil rights laws that Congress had passed at the time could not be enforced, but for in a very, very narrow way. Next slide. The will of the federal government to enforce these measures was diminished also by an economic crisis that happened in 1873. And so by the time the election of 1876 rolled around, a lot of Reconstruction was actually already over. The federal will to enforce Reconstruction measures had really waned, and Republicans were much more timid than they had been in the past. The violent techniques that Democrats used to suppress African American votes were no secret, as this cartoon from Harper's Weekly shows. They readily resorted to violence, threats, and murder itself to ensure election victories and take back the South, despite the fact that in many areas, African Americans were in the majority or close to the majority. The 1876 election, as we heard a bit about in the fall, was a contested election in which Black votes and the suppression of Black votes made all the difference in the contested states of Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. Ultimately, as a result of the compromise of 1877, a Republican, Rutherford Hayes, was put into office. But this marked a turning point in some ways, although it's kind of debatable how much of a turning point it was, in the kind of ongoing reduction and refusal of the federal government to protect African Americans' rights in the way that it had previously promised to. Next slide. So I think it's interesting, it's difficult to talk about this moment in which many Americans tried very hard to create a multiracial democracy, to provide federal enforcement for individual rights that would come into play if state and local governments violated people's rights, and to see the story of how that effort was brought down by white supremacy and the incapacity of the federal government to continue with enforcement. But one redeeming feature of this story is how the Constitution was changed. And so I just leave you with this final thought. The Reconstruction Amendments, with their promises of dignity and equality and of federal enforcement when state and local governments fail, remain crucial foundations of individual rights, including the right to vote. Thank you.
Professor Mazer, thank you. Fascinating. I don't know about the rest of you on this Zoom event, but I am certainly learning things. And I was particularly struck there by the 4 million enslaved people in the US in 1860, and they were worth $3 billion in total in 1860 dollars. I just grabbed an online calculator. That would be $95 billion in today's money. Now we want to welcome Professor Bill Harris. In the decade or so after the end of the Civil War, Black Americans continued to make gains and started demanding full citizenship. The South continued to resist, though, and Congress in the North became increasingly indifferent to enforcing the rights of Blacks that were conferred on them by those amendments. Southern states created new laws that curtailed Black activity in nearly every sphere of life. These laws are no longer on the books technically, but their lasting impact remains. And that sets up Professor Harris, sir.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks to Professor Mazer for leading into this. I'm going to follow her here and also follow her chronologically with what I'm calling the rise of Jim Crow. And I'm using Jim Crow here not just to mean a synonym for segregation or discrimination, but really an entire system put into place by the states of the South, the former Confederacy, to enforce white supremacy. And importantly, this did not happen immediately after that 1877 date when the Republicans finally lost power in all of the Southern states. It didn't really happen until the 1890s, which is an interesting aspect of what we're talking about, because Black Southerners did not immediately in 1877 disappear from political life. The three aspects of Jim Crow I'll emphasize, I'll call them the Iron Triangle: disfranchisement, segregation, and violence. Next slide, please. Who was Jim Crow? Here's a picture of Jim Crow. He was a character in a minstrel show invented by a white actor, a white guy from the North in the 1830s who dressed up in this outfit as supposedly a slave in blackface and mocked slavery with his language and stories and sang a little song called Jumpin' Jim Crow. And this image of Black inferiority was taken up by Black Southerners after the Civil War as a kind of a shorthand when they were talking about white discrimination. If a local or state legislature, for example, instituted a segregation law, they would say, we're being Jim Crowed. Jim Crow, again, involves a complex, and that's what I'll try to briefly summarize here. The next slide, please. Why the 1890s? White Southerners in the 1890s wrote constantly about their fears of a new generation of African Americans. They had this mythological notion of enslaved people as docile, well-trained, polite, and so forth. And we see from Professor Mazer's introduction that was not at all true. In fact, they were desperate to get out of slavery. They volunteered for the Union Army, they voted, and so forth. But nevertheless, Southern whites claimed to believe in the 1890s that the new generation that hadn't been sort of properly trained by masters was causing all sorts of trouble. And here's a good example. Ida Wells was born in 1862. She went to one of these Freedmen Bureau schools that Professor Mazer mentioned. She went to a college set up by white missionaries to train former slaves. She became a teacher. She moved to Memphis. And in 1883, she was riding in the ladies' car, the first class car of a train, and the conductor told her this was a car for white ladies only. And she said, I'm a lady, I'm not getting up. And the conductor said, yes, you are, and grabbed her. She grabbed onto her seat. She sank his teeth into his wrist, drawing blood. He finally called up 2 or 3 other white men who pulled her up from her seat. They stopped the train and they threw her off. And she actually sued the railroad company. She was not violating a law. This was simply a rule of the railroad company, which she said was a violation of old English common law. And she actually won in the lower courts, but eventually the Tennessee Supreme Court said, well, she wasn't really a lady, so she wasn't allowed to sit in a lady's car. Next slide, please. And the other thing that whites were really concerned about, aside from what they would call uppity Negroes, was that blacks still exercised a great deal of political power in some places. And it was always a threat to white supremacy. And embodiment of that threat is this man, Tom Watson of Georgia, who was a founder of a new third party in the 1890s called the People's Party, commonly called the Populist Party, but its official name was the People's Party. And Tom Watson wrote extensively about the need for black and white small farmers and other middle-class people to unite politically to prevent the massive corruption that was being caused by the rise of big corporations and big banks and so forth, and monopolies. And as you'll hear in the next presentation from Chris Everett, at one point in the state of North Carolina, an alliance of whites and blacks did take power, the white populists and black Republicans, and you'll see the consequences of that in his presentation. Next slide, please. So how did Southern whites, at least the ones who were determined to enforce white supremacy, respond? One way was disfranchisement, taking away the right to vote from blacks. And here we see the pictures of the men who made up the Mississippi Constitutional Convention of 1890, which was the first state to formally start passing amendments to their own constitution to try to eliminate black voters. If you look very carefully, there is one black face in this picture. Otherwise, it's all white men in a state where the majority of population was African American. Next slide, please. One of their problems was the 15th Amendment, which, as Professor Maser just outlined, at least in theory, prevented discrimination on the basis of race. If we look at the text of the 15th Amendment, the rights of citizens of the United States shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. How do you get around this restriction? Well, you think of ways that will actually eliminate the black vote without you having to write out that what we're doing is eliminating the black vote. That is, you think of theoretically non-racial ways to limit the vote. And anyone who reads the newspapers these days or watching the news will recognize at least some of these which are still going on. So for example, institute a poll tax, require people to pay to vote. Institute a residency requirements. Many black sharecroppers, poor farmers had to move around frequently from year to year. And if they didn't live long enough in the same county or precinct, they could be denied the right to vote. Require literacy. And if slaves were not only were slaves not taught to read and write, it was actually illegal to teach enslaved people to read and write in most states. So most African Americans after the Civil War were not literate, and by the 1890s, there were still about 50% illiteracy. People convicted of felonies. This should be familiar. Many states are using the same kind of restriction because, in part, because of gross discrimination in the justice system, it was much easier to convict African Americans of felonies than whites. So all of these would not mention race, but they would in fact eliminate most of the black votes. The problem here was that all of these things would also potentially eliminate white votes. And a lot of white Southerners, including in Mississippi, didn't like that. So if we show the next part of this, Mississippi pioneered in thinking up what might be called a white loophole. Their loophole stated that if you could convince the registrar that you understood the Mississippi state constitution, which of course was a grossly subjective process, then even if you weren't qualified to vote on any other grounds, you would be allowed to vote. And other states took this set of restrictions and began to copy them. So if you see the next slide. And it's interesting to see what the people in these conventions were saying openly. They couldn't write in the law that we're denying black people the right to vote. That would have been unconstitutional. But when they were debating in the conventions themselves, they had no compunction about being very open about what we were doing. In South Carolina, for example, one of the leaders of the whole effort said, we don't propose to have fair elections. In Alabama, we want to establish white supremacy in this state. If that had been in the law, it would have been outlawed by the Supreme Court, but they didn't put that in the law. In Virginia, we want to discriminate to the very extremity of permissible action. State after state, eventually all the former Confederate states instituted one form or another of these voting restrictions. If we see the next slide, you can see the results here for one of the states that actually kept registration by race. So it's very easy to follow the course of events, how many people could register to vote who are white and who are classified as Negro at the time. In 1897, before Louisiana's new laws passed, that tall bar on the left shows the number of white registrants. The slightly shorter bar next to it is the number of African-American registrants. And they should have been about equal because the population was equal, but nevertheless, there's obviously a very large African-American potential vote. A few years later, after the Louisiana Constitution was changed, we see what's happened. The white vote, interestingly enough, has been cut almost in half, and the black vote has been almost completely eliminated. And this is the effect of disfranchisement throughout the South. Essentially, the protections of the 15th Amendment were done away with. Next slide. Why didn't the Supreme Court outlaw this? Well, black lawyers sued in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. Interestingly enough, some of these were black lawyers who were also born in the age of slavery and then trained in colleges afterwards. And the Supreme Court said, no, the laws do not specifically mention race. So even if they happen to, as a coincidence, eliminate most of the black vote, they do not violate the 15th Amendment. So the process worked. The next slide, please. The second response, so the first response was disfranchisement, eliminate political power insofar as we can. The next response was segregation. Not segregation just by custom, but by law, because throughout the United States, even in the North, segregation by custom was very common. Most restaurants and hotels in the North, for example, would not allow blacks to buy their food or stay in their hotels. But in the 1890s, again, not right after 1877, Southern states started passing laws defining segregation by race in all sorts of ways. Railroads, trolleys, hotels and restaurants, schools, and other ways. If you look at some of these, the ramifications of this throughout the South, it's really quite extraordinary. And there were cities in which there were separate Bibles in courtrooms for blacks and whites to put their hands on and swear to tell the truth. In Birmingham, it was illegal for blacks and whites to play chess together or to see films that showed black and white boxers together. So this whole ramification of segregation was almost endless. The next slide. The whole system of segregation, like the system of voting restrictions, was challenged by African Americans in the South, and probably the most famous Supreme Court case of the 19th century dealing with race, Plessy versus Ferguson, where a group of African Americans in New Orleans raised money, hired lawyers, and challenged Louisiana's segregation law for railroads, saying it violated the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection of the laws. And if we see, if you advance here, the man we see here, Homer Plessy, who was a part of that effort, allowed himself to be arrested on a train by a hired detective so that he could go to court and say my arrest for sitting in a white car was a violation of the Constitution. It took 4 years for that case to work its way to the Supreme Court, where in their famous decision, the Supreme Court voted 8-1 against Plessy and said, nope, the 14th Amendment's equal protection does not prevent segregation. And if we look at the next slide, we can see the reasoning, if we can call it that, of the majority. In the nature of things, it could not have been intended to about the 14th Amendment, in the nature of things, could not have been intended to abolish distinctions based on color or to enforce social as distinguished from political equality. So the Supreme Court was accepting this notion, widespread notion, that social equality was something different from political or civic equality, and segregation in restaurants or hotels or trolley cars was protecting social inequalities, and that did not violate the Constitution. We see the next slide. We can see one of the most famous dissents in Supreme Court history, Judge John Harlan's dissent. He was the one vote. Interestingly enough, grew up in Kentucky as a member of a wealthy slave-holding family. One of the slaves in his family may have been his half-brother, and he knew what was going on. The arbitrary separation of citizens, he said, on the basis of race is a badge of servitude. That is, it is an echo of slavery. And here's a man who knew what slavery was, and he understood the purpose of segregation was to put that badge of servitude onto African Americans. It is inconsistent with civil freedom and the equality before the law established by the Constitution. But of course, he lost. The next slide, and just very briefly, since we're dealing with an audience obviously interested in health disparities, if you combine disfranchisement plus segregation, you get a whole vast series of consequences for people's health. And I'll just mention a few here. In cities, sewers, paved roads, and clean water went into white neighborhoods, but not Black neighborhoods. When cities built public hospitals, they were either all white, or they might have a few beds for Black people who would have to go into a different part of the different entrance of the hospital. Physicians and nurses were not educated. Black physicians and nurses were not educated in public colleges. Black physicians and nurses were not allowed to practice in white hospitals. And so these are just some examples of the way, again, you combine lack of political power and segregation that ramifies through the health system in multiple ways, both public health and treatment and education and every other way, which is why we speak of systemic racism, the way racism gets built into the whole system if it lasts over a long time. Next slide, please. Finally, the third part of what I've called this iron triangle after disfranchisement and segregation is violence. And this was violence sometimes inflicted by public authorities, as in George Floyd, but also inflicted mostly outside the law. And one of the most horrific examples is a picture you're seeing right here that was taken in 1893 in Paris, Texas. This is a crowd. There may have been thousands of people present, and they're watching a Black man first being tortured with hot irons, and then he will be burned to death in front of them. And he was accused of murdering a white child. He may have done it, we'll never know. He was almost certainly suffering from certain kinds of mental disabilities. But this is an extreme case, but an extreme case of a much more common phenomenon of lynching. Between 3,000 and 4,000 African Americans at least were lynched in the southern states between 1880 and 1930. Violence took many other forms. You'll again hear about one of them in the next presentation by Chris Everett. Finally, African Americans resisted. It's important to keep in mind that African Americans simply did not accept this. And I'll go back to Ida Wells as the final point I'll make. Specifically, she went to Memphis, as I said, became a teacher. She went into journalism. She was fired because the teaching board didn't like her editorials. One of her good friends was lynched, one of 3 businessmen lynched in 1892. And she wrote an editorial about it based on a lot of her research into the phenomena of the lynching, and pointed out that Black men who had been lynched for supposedly raping white women were often engaged in consensual sexual affairs with these women. This was so outrageous to the white population of Memphis that they burned her newspaper down, and they probably would have lynched her, except she happened to be out of the city in New York City at the time. And while she was out, she wrote the first of several very important publications, Southern Horrors, Lynch Law, and All Its Phases. And among other things, she advised Blacks to boycott white businesses and also to keep a Winchester rifle at home so that if the lynch mob comes for you, you get some of them also. So the final slide, just to reiterate, if we think of three things I'm trying to emphasize, Jim Crow was a system of white supremacy. It was imposed by white Southerners in the 1890s and involved disfranchisement, segregation, and violence, but it was also accepted by the federal government. The courts agree with it. Congress did not use any of its powers to suppress it. Presidents did not do anything either. And very importantly, it was always, from the very beginning, contested by Blacks and sometimes with white allies, from then, of course, until now. So thank you.
All right, Professor Harris, thank you very much for that. That Paris, Texas incident, I took my breath away, the horror of that. And, you know, the talk of laws limiting the vote, you know, that's in the news today. Some of these things are literally still going on. All right, and we want to remind everybody you can ask questions. We're going to have a Q&A session right after the final presentation here. You can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen there, and you can type in your question. We'll get to as many of those as we can. After we hear from documentary filmmaker Christopher Everett. Efforts to curtail the advancement of Black Americans did stop their progress, even though the Jim Crow laws were frequently aided and abetted through intimidation and violence by whites. Now, in Wilmington, North Carolina, by the way, I might have said Delaware earlier. Wilmington, North Carolina, November of 1898, an armed mob of white supremacists attacked Black neighborhoods and businesses, driving out most of the Black citizens and ousting them from legitimate government positions they had as well. Mr. Everett's film explores those events. And here is Christopher Everett.
Hey everyone, how are you doing? My name is Christopher Everett. I'm the director of Wilmington on Fire, and that documentary is a feature-length documentary about the Wilmington massacre of 1898. I'll be sharing a few clips with you today mostly, but I want to first start off with just giving a brief overview of what the Wilmington massacre of 1898 was about. The Wilmington massacre of 1898 was a bloody attack on the African-American community by a heavily armed white mob on November 10th, 1898, in the port city of Wilmington, North Carolina. It's considered one of the only successful examples of a violent overthrow of an existing government and left countless numbers of African Americans dead and exiled from the city. This event was the springboard for the white supremacy movement and Jim Crow segregation throughout the state of North Carolina and the rest of the American South. So I want to start off today with taking you back, I guess, to the Civil War. And like I said, after each clip, I'll be briefly talking about each one as well. So begin the first clip now.
When the Confederacy lost the Civil War to the Union, this ain't talked about a lot. But when they lost, the fury that came out of that loss was fueled by the fact that they lost to Black soldiers. Remember, up until Blacks enlisting in the Civil War, the Union was losing to the Confederacy. The Mason-Dixon line runs through Pennsylvania. That's how far north the South had pushed. It was Blacks who beat the Confederacy, not whites, not Abraham Lincoln. It was Blacks who defeated the South. That is what fueled the hatred of the Southern white man for the Black man more than it had ever been fueled before. I didn't lose to Abraham Lincoln's army. I lost to my own slaves.
In my research of a lot of these people that were involved in this, when they returned from the Civil War to North Carolina, they got involved in Democratic politics. And because at the time, the Democratic Party was basically pure white. There were no Black Democrats in the South.
Because the United States did not pursue a policy that we refer to as lustration, which is the prevention of traitors from continued participation in the political process. I mean, the United States was very gentle in its treatment to the ex-Confederates. And the ex-Confederates were insistent that Black political participation would have to be stopped. This included, particularly in South Carolina and Louisiana, the assassination of a number of Black elected officials. But in North Carolina, it almost results in the lynching of the white Republican fusion governor. And it does result ultimately in the destruction of the Black community in Wilmington, North Carolina.
All right. Cool. That pretty much sets up to, Wilmington. During the Civil War, Wilmington was a major port for the Confederacy during this time. And it was one of the last ports to fall to the Union Army in, I think, February 1865. And so even after the Civil War, a lot of the Black soldiers who were part of the Union military, they decided to stay and just decided to make a home in Wilmington and throughout the Cape Fear region. And so did a lot of the white Union soldiers as well. And so that whole Cape Fear region just started to grow and grow. And then eventually Wilmington became this mecca, and it became North Carolina's largest city by the 1890s. So let's begin that next clip about Wilmington.
It was a very prosperous city. It was the largest city in North Carolina. It had a population in which the blacks outnumbered the whites. It was thriving commerce at the seaport. Their literacy rate had increased unbelievably high since the Emancipation at the end of the Civil War. They had tradesmen in every trade you can think of. There are barbers. Almost all of the eating places were owned by blacks. There were blacks who were on the police force, fire department. They were just part of a real community.
By the 1890s, you had, 4 lawyers in Wilmington. You had a Black doctor in Wilmington. And I cite in my book, it was called a Mecca. There were advertisements in newspapers stating, come to Wilmington, there's good jobs here. And you have to also remember that Wilmington was a port, a very important port. So anytime you have a port city, there's always a way for them to strive and survive, and prosper.
I know that the ports were a major industry in Wilmington because sea work was a major industry for our people, even during chattel enslavement. In the Cape Fear River region, those waters and navigating those waters were largely done by who they called Negro seamen. So you have the men passing this tradition down to the other young men in their families. So you had many shrimpers and shrimping companies and fishing companies. You still have some Gullah Geechee-owned clam companies that come out of Wilmington. And so that was a big, big industry for our people.
All right. As you can see, Wilmington became this place for African Americans to thrive. And, really because of the economic climate, the social climate, and most importantly, the political climate. And out of this rose a new concept of fusion politics, not only in Wilmington, but throughout the state of North Carolina. And fusion politics were Black Republicans and white populists coming together, based on common interests to really try to take over political power, not only in Wilmington, but throughout North Carolina as well. And so we'll get into this next clip about fusion politics.
Politically, African Americans held roles in the management of both the city and the county. And we had members of the African American community on the Board of Aldermen, which was the elected body that ran the affairs of the city at the time. They had been serving on the Board of Aldermen from earlier periods all the way through till 1898. And at the state level, we had African Americans serving in the legislature and in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. These weren't people from Wilmington, but yet at the same point, African Americans had a voice in politics from the local level all the way up prior to 1898.
One of the things that a lot of people talk about, and Tim Tyson and other people have written this anthology called Democracy Betrayed. And I think it's a good point. I think it was working, this experiment, if you want to call it an experiment, of blacks and whites joining together, voting together as a bloc, putting their people in. It was working. So I think, to answer your question, the blacks, the African Americans in Wilmington, were on a new vista. They said, well, we were freed from slavery. Now we're freedmen. Now we can be a part of this political process. We can be a part of this economic process. And we can be a part of this social process. And that's what you have to have in order to be, I think, in order to be a fulfilled American citizen. You have to feel like you're part of this process. And I think they definitely felt that they were part of the process, just by the mere fact that they had someone that looked like them on the board of aldermen. I think it was great. It was apparently a good time to be alive before November 11th, 1898. It's not funny though, is it?
All right. As you see, Fusion was this coalition of Black Republicans and white populists during the time, but the white supremacist movement was still in play as well during this time. So they wanted to break up this Fusion movement, just like, Bill was saying earlier about really breaking up these type of coalitions that were going on, specifically in North Carolina, especially with the Fusion movement. So the Democratic Party during the time decided that they wanted to eliminate this whole Fusion coalition and regain power throughout North Carolina, and especially take over in Wilmington as well. And so they created certain factions throughout the Democratic Party. They had the strong arm of the red shirts, which were similar to the Ku Klux Klan at the time, but they didn't wear a mask and they did a lot of their stuff in broad daylight. And you also had another faction of the White Government Union. And this were more like your political white supremacy clubs as well, of your doctors, lawyers, politicians, those type of thing. And through some of the documentation of the White Government Union in their bylaws, and we'll show in this clip in a minute, is that was their whole sole purpose, was to break up this Fusion coalition and to bring the white men of this coalition back to the side of white supremacy and the Democratic Party. So let's show that clip for the White Government Union.
It's the Constitution and bylaws of the White Government Union created in 1897 by the North Carolina Democratic Party. And it's an actual pamphlet that was printed by the Democratic Party in Raleigh, North Carolina. We're going to get a better copy than this because the copier at Latimer House is not the best, but this is what we got for right now. And it's several pages long, and it describes how they're to organize, how they're to report, and how their aim is to install white supremacy government in North Carolina. It even tells them how to organize. The White Government Union was a secret political society that is prohibited by the Constitution of the state of North Carolina. It is much like the Klan, but actually much more organized and even much greater secrecy involving the White Government Union. The White Government Union was created by a vote of the North Carolina Executive Committee of the North Carolina Democratic Party in 1897. Wilmington attorney William Barry McCoy was its first executive chairman. And he was also the attorney for New Hanover County. He was like the prosecutor. He was also the chairman of the New Hanover County Board of Elections and a member of the Masons and many other social and political organizations in New Hanover County. He was an attorney who had actually studied law under a Supreme Court Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court. The White Government Union was actually created to organize the Democrats, to terrorize the populists, and to vote Democrat, and to break up the fusionist coalition of the populist and black Republicans so that the Democrats could re-seize political power in North Carolina. And in fact, I've got a copy of their Constitution and bylaws here, and in their preface, they say that's exactly what their intent is to do. There's been a division between the white men. Well, the division was the Democratic Party and the Populist Party. And so the White Government Union was created to break up that fusion of the Populists and Republicans. And it even says so right here in their Constitution and bylaws, that was their intent.
right? Um, all right, as you can see, doing this Wilmington insurrection was very calculated, very strategic, very organized. So I remember when I first started researching this, I thought it was just a spontaneous incident. But when you see the different layers, as you're seeing in the clips, that it was a very thought out and calculated white supremacy movement during this time. And with the use of the white government union and the red shirts and these other white supremacist factions throughout the Democratic Party at this time, they also used the media of the day to push their agenda that eventually led to the climate of violence and racial terror that eventually leads to the 1898 Wilmington insurrection on November 10th, 1898. And we still see those similarities to this day in regards to some media outlets. So let's do the last clip for the day of propaganda.
Propaganda is essential to any military campaign. Black people tend not to understand propaganda. And the reason why we tend not to understand propaganda is because the propaganda channels, the mediums, the conduits, the radio, the television, the newspaper, we tend to just treat as forms of entertainment. We don't see them as military strategy. When there's a movie depicting black people in a negative image, when there's caricatures in the newspaper making jokes about black people, we tend to just see it as political entertainment. We don't see it as laying the foundation before the storm. That's exactly what they did in Wilmington. You always seek to create a context that allows your military campaign to be acceptable. There's always context. You study Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany. He had a propaganda campaign that lasted over a year before he began to physically oppress the Jews. He had to make sure that the national mindset had been conditioned to accept the extermination to come. In Wilmington, North Carolina, the same exact thing happened years before Nazi Germany. Through the magazines, through the radio, through word of mouth, through stage play, they created negative images of black people in the minds of white folk in case there were any liberals who would have been against what they were going to do. They were slowly able to reform their opinion by constantly repeating negative information about the target population. See, the one thing about the brain that we got to understand is the creature of repetition. Whoever has the most access to the brain rules the brain. It's all about volume, not quality. The more you tell people that a certain group of people are no good, the more you show images, the more you show sounds, song, poem, dance, projecting negative information about a people, sooner or later, the subconscious begins to get conditioned automatically, because you can't turn off the subconscious to what it sees and what it hears. Sound and image, you cannot stop it except to stay away from it. So sound and image are critical to any propaganda campaign because they help lessen the defenses of anyone who may be against what you're trying to do. It's the same thing happening right now. There is a direct assault on the image of the black man and woman internationally. So when mass incarceration, homicide takes place, nobody cares what's happening to black folk because they've already been conditioned to believe that these people are better off dead anyway. So propaganda is the first stage of military warfare. Right now, we're being set up for another extermination campaign. It's going to be worse than what went on in Wilmington, Tulsa, Charleston, Rosewood. It's going to be worse. Whenever the propaganda gets worse, then you know the extermination is going to be that much worse, because you see how far the exterminator had to go in order to condition the people to prepare them for the carnage to come.
Cool. All right. Well, that's pretty much the clips from the film Wilmington on Fire. I just wanted to kind of give people an overview of kind of, the backstory of Wilmington and, Black folks in Wilmington, and also the white supremacist movement that led up to the massacre of 1898. And, Wilmington is really still struggling with this today. But, they're a resilient people. The community is starting to really come forward, with this dark past, and is really trying to do some things about it. And so the future is bright for that city. And, I'm just happy that they were, I guess, wanted me to do the documentary about this history, and, wanted to do them justice. So that's it for me.
All right, thank you, Mr. Everett. Very, very powerful stuff. And as a journalist, I get it. I certainly get it. We're going to go to our Q&A session now. And if you do have a question, you can type it in the Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom link. But I kind of wanted to start with a question for all of our panelists. And I guess let's go in reverse order. So Mr. Everett, let's start with you. Can we draw a line, from some of these incidents, Wilmington, for example, the massacre there, and the deficits we see today in the economic status, the healthcare disparities, and the political power of African Americans? Is there a direct line, and can we draw that? Let's start with you, Mr. Everett.
Oh yeah, definitely. You can definitely draw it. With everyone's presentation, we all lay out the data, to show how that's a direct correlation to, till today. In regards to Wilmington, I know it's one organization called the Cape Fear Collective. And what they've been doing over the past few years is doing those type of studies to bring the data forward. Because, a lot of time people say, well, can you really prove it? And so these folks actually did it. And they show the direct correlation of poverty, mass incarceration, unemployment, the wealth gap. And a lot of this stuff stems from, especially in Wilmington after the 1898 massacre, because prior to 1898, it was really a quote unquote somewhat equal society and playing field throughout the city of Wilmington and several parts of North Carolina. But after the 1898 massacre comes, you see a decrease in school funding, where at one time, people were getting equal funding for education across the board. After the massacre, Black schools are getting like $100 a year, when they were getting, thousands of dollars a year prior. So you started to see those disparities hit hard right after the massacre, right when Jim Crow is set up throughout North Carolina. And those disparities linger on, if people aren't able to access wealth, over this time period. And the last civil rights bill was like, 68? And then it really depends also if your city or town really wanted to implement those civil rights initiatives. So a lot of cities didn't even really fully integrate to maybe the late 70s in some places. And so when you look at that, that's not that long ago, and it just shows that we still have a long way to go to change these disparities.
And what you may not be aware of, Mr. Everett, is the two communities that we are kind of focused on here are the cities of St. Joe, Michigan, and Benton Harbor, Michigan. St. Joe is approximately 85% white. Benton Harbor is approximately 80% Black. And the differences in the two downtowns, the differences in the school systems, the differences in the economic opportunities, the educational opportunities are very stark. So your point is very well taken. Professor Harris, what do you think about that direct parallel? I mean, you talked about laws, that were on the books, during Reconstruction and Jim Crow, and there are not the
Sound familiar, right?
Yeah, but what do you think?
Well, I think Chris Everett is right. There is a direct line, but I would say maybe it's the way historians think. It's a crooked line, because sometimes things change in one place in a positive way at the same time that they're changing in a different place in a very negative way. Things can change in a very positive way at one time, and then things can go backward at other times. And what we've seen, starting with Professor Mazur's presentation, the creation of the 3 Reconstruction amendments was there's no question, one prominent historian just called it the second founding of the Constitution. It made a major difference in American life, but unless those constitutional amendments were enforced by Congress and by the president and so forth, those rights that were theoretically guaranteed could be taken back, which is what happened in the 1890s. So I think we have to see, to me, what's the most straight line is that the struggle is continuous. It never goes away. There are white supremacists and there are African Americans who overwhelmingly are struggling against it, and whites sometimes are allied with African Americans, and that's what the most continuous thing that I think about when I think of it as a historian.
And if we don't know our history, we are doomed to repeat it, right? So, Professor Mazur, what's your take on the direct links from, the post-Civil War to today and the condition that many African American communities and residents find themselves in?
I guess I'll just say this is not perhaps directly related to what I talked about, but I do think it's sometimes hard for people to really wrap their mind around what we call structural racism. So what you described about the communities, or when we see, within one city, a Black neighborhood, without grocery stores, with underfunded schools, and a white neighborhood or white suburbs or predominantly white suburbs where the schools are very well funded. And then you look around and sort of think, well, this is really nobody's fault because, it's not like you can find the person, the people who are planning to perpetrate a racial massacre, right? So we're not living sometimes, but for the most part, not living among some of the kinds of white supremacy that, for example, the Colfax massacre that I talked about, or New Orleans or Memphis in 1866. And so I think we have to really begin to understand on a structural level how these inequalities are created through underfunding, through lack of resources, through resource deprivation. And I think, as a historian, kind of speaking to what Bill said, I think your next panel chronologically will do this probably better, because some of what we see now actually has most to do with 20th century things like housing policies, zoning, suburbanization, federal investment in suburbanization, redlining, that kind of thing. And so there is a lot of fluctuation over time, and it's a good idea to be specific about sort of which aspects are immediate causes, and then looking at the big picture of both the kind of moments when this country has made progress on these issues and what are the forces of reaction that have prevented greater progress.
Well, we will have our third panel next month. You guys are welcome to join us again if you want to go from kind of the 1900s forward to today. I want to get to some of the questions that are coming in from our viewers through the Zoom Q&A function. This one's from a viewer called Max. And he says, quote, "It is amazing to see a repetition of history in the way attempts are being made today to implement disenfranchisement. Any suggestions on what recourse we have today to prevent this from happening, or lessons from history that can be used to take the proper actions today?" Anybody want to start with that one? Professor Mazur, you were nodding your head there. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I've thought about this, and I'm sure everybody on the panel has, and people in the audience, but the thing that we're facing right now is the state government's abilities to constrain access to the vote. Some of that is made possible by the Supreme Court's decision in 2013, Shelby County versus Holder, which sort of invalidated part of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So it is actually much easier now than it was before 2013, if you're a state government and you want to restrict access to the vote, to do it and not worry about the Justice Department. And so my take is, history shows us that we really only come close to having a functioning democracy where all the people who are eligible to vote can vote when we have federal regulation with the vote. We have to have strong federal protections, like we more or less had until 2013, as are in the 1965 Voting Rights Act and subsequent voting acts, as provided for going back to the 15th Amendment. Because if we don't, we see there will always be people coming into power in the states who, through whatever reasons, whether it's because of outright racism or just wanting their party to stay in power, they will do shenanigans with the right to vote. They will constrict people's right to vote. They won't permit citizens to vote. They'll make it harder in all kinds of ways that circumvent the 15th Amendment, as Bill described. And so to me, we need to, if we care about this issue, we need to stop these initiatives at the state level by fighting back at the state level. And then we need to tell Congress to pass the 2 voting rights bills that are now going to be before Congress in this session.
Mr. Everett, what's your take on that? What do you think people should do to fight against voter disenfranchisement these days in those efforts?
Well, I think, what, Kate just said, and also, just people just continue to organize and exercise your right. I know a lot of times people say, my vote doesn't count. Yes, it does. And I think a lot of times we shoot our own self in the foot. Sometimes when we don't take advantage of these certain opportunities that we do have, and also get involved. You have a lot of organizations out there that want to help and help with voter registration and voter participation, and to help push for the change of some of the laws. So I think we all can do our part instead of just sitting back on the sideline. Get involved. You don't have to do anything major like run for office or anything. You can just do something in the town or city where you're at, just getting involved in just the small ways.
Yeah, voter registration drives, and we certainly saw that in the last presidential election, record-setting turnout. Professor Harris, what's your take on that? This kind of history repeating itself, and what can be done about it?
Yeah, well, historians are a little worried about when we hear history repeats itself, but we kind of like Mark Twain's comment that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Things happen in a similar way, but the context is very different. But again, how you defeat this is fight against it. And we saw in the state of Georgia, I grew up in Georgia. I taught at the University of New Hampshire for many years, but I grew up in Georgia. And the powers in Georgia, some of them were racist, some of them, as Professor Mazur said, were just determined to keep the Republican Party in power, instituted all sorts of voting restrictions in the past few years. And yet, in the most recent election, astonishingly for someone who grew up in Georgia, I can promise you, a Black Baptist preacher became senator and a young Jewish guy became the other senator. And the Democrats Biden carried the election. So when you fight back hard and when you organize, I think Chris Everett's point about organization is extremely important. You can't just wait for things to happen. You really have to organize to fight against it. And that can work, but the other side is organizing too. So that's why I think of it as a contest rather than a sort of a simple straight line.
Interesting. Thank you all. Here's another question. This one comes from a woman named Elizabeth. And she says, would you agree that another impact of Wilmington, the massacre, Tulsa, where there was another just horrible massacre 100 years ago, and others, is that Black professionals usually seek to open business in big cities and not smaller areas due to the layered issues you discussed in your documentary? Okay, Chris, so I think this one's specifically for you. She says, for example, I am the only Black attorney with an office in 49022. That's the zip code for Benton Harbor, Michigan, one of the two twin cities here. What do you think about that? Is that why more African Americans, particularly professionals, go to larger cities? Is there something there?
I would say, we go to larger places. I would say back then, they went to places like Wilmington because, they had the access to the resources, to get going. That's why a lot of people were drawn to it because of the port activity. And Wilmington back then had some of the highest paying wages in the state of North Carolina. So people are going to go, where those opportunities are at. Even to this day, a lot of people, they go to places where the best jobs are, where the highest wages are, good schools, more opportunity. But you're starting to see people going to more smaller places because also smaller areas, it's just more cost efficient. If you're living in New York, paying like $3,000 a month in rent, it doesn't make sense. You can come down south to a small rural area, maybe pay $800 a month. So, it's really based off of economics and where you can really get your foot in the door, so to speak. And a lot of African Americans don't really have a lot of that access to the capital. So you have to go where the capital is a lot of times, to whether it's starting a business or, getting that great paying job to eventually start a business.
Professor Harris, what's your take on that and kind of the concentration of Black professionals in larger communities?
It's a very interesting question and a good question. And to some extent, the questioner is absolutely right. When you have partly because Black business owners, professionals, and so forth are just discriminated against in all sorts of ways in our modern economy. And so if you are in a place with a large African-American population, there's more of a chance for you to build up a clientele, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're a grocery and so forth. But there's actually some very interesting research that's been done by historians in North Carolina in particular, but in the South in general in this area, that despite the tremendous amount of discrimination, a fairly substantial Black business class was built up. And yes, it was concentrated in places like Wilmington, Atlanta, Durham, North Carolina, but even in very small towns, you could find a Black grocer, blacksmith, artisans, sometimes who even built up white clientele. So a lot of it depends on, again, the very specific examples, but it also takes, I imagine your questioner has an entrepreneurial spirit and was willing to open an office in a place that wasn't maybe obvious for her, but she has a lot of predecessors in the Black community ever since the Civil War.
Professor Mazur, your take on the concentration of African-American professionals in larger communities?
I don't have too much of it. I don't think I have too much to add to what my co-panelists have already said.
You certainly live in Evanston, Illinois, which is a very racially diverse area, and Chicago has a huge African-American community, no question about that. We got another question. This one is from a viewer named Kim. She says, it's so interesting that I'd never heard that enslaved people were so responsible for their own freedom in the Civil War. Do you feel that it's an example of whitewashing history and white saviorism that we tend only to learn about the white abolitionists as the heroes? You want to start with that one, Professor Mazur?
Yes, I really like that question and appreciate it. You know, if you are a person who, okay, I'll just say yes, in a way, yes. I just do think that the reason that we don't learn that history of all the things that Black people did to get free during the Civil War, and also about the history of Black abolitionism before the Civil War, besides maybe Frederick Douglass, but it was actually a much bigger sustained movement than that. Yeah, it has to do with biases and how we are taught history, have generally been taught history. There is so much more to Black history in particular than most people know. I will say that. And also this particular history of self-emancipation, we can call it, during the Civil War, the relentless movement of enslaved people to Union lines, demands to be free, wanting to be free, pushing the US government to advance its policies of emancipation. That's partly not known also because until like the 1980s or so, historians hadn't really looked at the documents, which are troves and troves of documents, mostly in the United States National Archives, that document that history. So it's well known now, and it's already made its way into some textbooks, I believe. But if you went to college or high school earlier than the 80s, actually that particular thing of like self-emancipation during the Civil War might not have actually been a thing that was even knowable in a lot of ways. Although anyway, it has something to do with the rise of Black history as a subfield, which people have been doing since the 19th century. There have been Black people writing Black history, but really entered into academia around the civil rights era and became a thing where there are Black studies departments, there are Black history fields. And so we know so much more now than we have before. But I would encourage people to just, check out the resources that are provided through this event. I welcome anyone to email me for recommendations, because it's tremendous how much we don't know, but how much is out there for us to know.
Professor Harris, your thoughts on kind of that whitewashing of history, I guess?
Well, I just have to agree with Kate Mazur on this. Yes, certainly, of course. I went to school, I said I was from Georgia. I went to a segregated school. There were no Black people in my school, and I have a very vague memory of whatever history I learned there, but it wasn't much, and there was virtually nothing about Black history, period. Much less about whether they had emancipated themselves. And as a historical phenomenon, as she said, it was really in the 60s and the civil rights movement that made people pay attention to the tremendous work of African-American historians and academic specialists who had not been hired at the great universities because they didn't hire Black people. So there's all sorts of reasons that was suppressed. And then, the civil rights movement certainly changed a lot of that, but not everything. And it took until I should put in a little kudos to Kate Mazer, because she's one of the people who worked on this project she mentioned that turns up this tremendous series of documents about African Americans during and immediately after the Civil War, which has taught us so much about their crucial role in the Civil War and afterwards.
Chris Everett, your take on the whitewashing of history and to a certain extent, why you did that documentary, right? Because you wanted to bring some hidden history forward, didn't you?
Totally. And, I totally agree with both Bill and Kate as well. But that's one of the reasons why I wanted to make the film. One, I never really saw a lot of African-American documentarians like that growing up, telling this type of history. I think, I looked up to people like Stanley Nelson, folks like that. But outside a handful of people, you didn't really see that. So, I've always was fascinated with this type of storytelling and doing it in a historical type of format. And I just felt it was important to do it and also have that part about the Civil War and Black soldiers liberating themselves and have a huge involvement in the Civil War. I really wanted to emphasize that, to show that, hey, African Americans just weren't sitting back on the sideline and just waiting to get free. They wanted to free themselves as well, just as bad, and really fight for freedom. And, we still, African Americans still fight for freedom to this day, not only for ourselves, but for this country as well. And so I try to show that even throughout my work and just show the power of media. I think media has a lot to do with that as well, of the whitewashing. And, we have to, create our own media channels as well and really push them out there to the fullest.
I appreciate all your thoughts. I do want to give you each, a minute or so to give our viewers who are with us a takeaway. What do you want people to take away from this discussion? What do you want them to talk about with their friends or their families? Professor Harris, why don't you start?
Well, I guess I would say one of the things that impressed me is how seamless these three presentations fit together. We got the deep background, some of the specifics, but also I really loved watching and listening to Chris Everett's clips and listening to him, because until you see how things work in a very detailed, specific way, it's hard to really get why the history is important or not, as opposed to a broad overview that I was trying to get. And so I hope the people participating in this are taking some of this away. And again, look at the resources that are attached to this and keep reading and keep working.
Professor Mazer, your final thoughts?
Sure. I have so many, but I think I just want to mention a comment that somebody typed in, that I have somehow envisioned positive change on a continuum. Tonight, I learned that we repeat history time and again. Progress is not a certainty from which we grow. It is a point in time exclusively. And I do think, we historians don't generally say history repeats itself. I don't think we're going in circles or cycles and every moment's different. But I do think one big takeaway is we can't really take progress for granted, and we can't look around ourselves and think that we must be on a trajectory toward better. And I think this country is always changing, but we're always, and this is what I usually say to students, we're always living right now in the aftermath of slavery. And for that matter, the aftermath of and continuing sort of settler colonialism. And so when we look around us at the structure of the world that we live in, all of us are implicated in this history. And I think it can only help us to think about that and to educate ourselves about it and not take progress for granted and do the things that are within our reach to make sure that good things are happening and to identify the dangerous things and call them out.
Mr. Everett, you get the final word here. What are your takeaways for the viewers?
I guess, a couple of my takeaways were, just accountability. We have to hold people accountable. When you see, just with the presentation about the Wilmington massacre, the federal government not holding the Confederacy accountable and allowing them to fully participate in politics, which led to things like the massacre and all these things that happened to African Americans. And then you also see, earlier this year, January 6th, what happened in Washington, D.C., just a lack of accountability. And it shows that when we don't hold people accountable, things just get out of hand and people get harmed, their rights, their lives, everything. And I would say also, another takeaway is just look what we can accomplish when we come together. And I always go back to that whole fusion movement. It was a great, no system is perfect. But it was a model that really was doing something wonderful in Wilmington and North Carolina, and there was a reason why the white supremacy movement wanted to destroy it. And you're starting to see folks trying to bring back a certain type of fusion movement once again. I know Reverend Barber down here in North Carolina, he's trying to re-energize another new fusion movement. So you're starting to see people trying to bring a fusion movement back again of everyone, white, Black, Hispanic coming together to make America, what it's, supposed to be about, equal and opportunity for all.
Yeah, and justice for all,
Yep.
as they say. Thank you all for a fascinating discussion. I certainly learned a lot. I would think our participants learned a lot. And that concludes the second of our 3 hidden history panels. The next one is in about a month, Tuesday, June 15th. There will be an email announcement with sign-up details just like this one. And if you'd like to see the first panel, that's available on YouTube, and this one will be too. All the viewers out there are going to be getting an opportunity in just a few minutes to answer a survey about tonight's discussion. Please, if you're willing, take the time to respond. We do welcome your feedback. It can help us with the next one. And if you want to pursue these topics on a more personal level here in the Twin Cities, Benton Harbor and St. Joe, you can look into Brave Talks. Those are small group meetings that are part of the Community Grand Rounds initiative from Lake Michigan College and from Spectrum Health Lakeland. Once again, thanks to our panelists, Professor Kate Mazur, Professor Bill Harris, and filmmaker Christopher Everett. And thanks to our sponsors, Spectrum Health Lakeland, Lake Michigan College, and the St. Joseph City Commission. For now, I'm Brian Conybeare from ABC 57. Thank you for taking part in this very important and at times very difficult discussion, but it's one that I hope you'll continue with your friends and your families in your neighborhoods. Good night.